the nations of the world, large or small, powerful or poor, admired or hated or feared, face one single common national security threat that clouds their future. This is the gravest threat of all times, and a threat that very few are aware of. Ironically, this immense threat that all the nations of the world face, which deeply affects them, especially their children, lies not outside their national borders. It lies within them, with each one individually. The national security of every nation depends on the mastery of this threat, which is a threat by omission. Security is not created by force, such as by great nations reaching across the world in search of monsters to destroy, as John Quincy Adams, the second U.S. president, had put it to Congress back in the late 1700s, when the USA was still a young republic. These wise words, of course, have been long forgotten. The world had become in many places a theater of perpetual wars, even monster wars, especially in modern time. We find them all instigated under the banner of national security or similar banners. While US President Trump almost quoted the wise words of John Quincy Adams in his speech to the United Nations General Assembly in September 2017, speaking for peace, tolerance, and against regime change wars. He delivered in the same speech a substantial list of monsters to destroy, citing North Korea, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, and Syria, not to mention Russia and China, the long-imagined arch-enemy of the West, against whom the largest ever military budget in US history was voted up. Obviously, the president spoke for his masters, the masters of the would-be American empire, issuing a doctrine of force in defense of yet another new world order. Nevertheless, as I said before, the greatest danger to national security for any nation lies not outside its borders, but within it. This is a message that no one likes to hear. The greatest danger to every nation's security, even to its very existence, is a passive danger that results from the nation failing to respond to the Ice Age challenge. The challenge is for humanity to create itself a technological new world in which it is able to continue to live on the Earth when the Earth becomes an ice planet in the 2050s. When the Earth enters the ice planet stage, it becomes uninhabitable by today's standard, with just a few minute exceptions, of course. To be or not to be thereby becomes a question of our response to the challenge. Will we respond and live, or won't we? Monumental evidence exists that a phase shift will occur in the dynamics that power our sun, by which the long-suspected new ice age will start up in the near future, potentially in the 2050s or sooner. This much is certain: humanity's failing to take actions on this front spells doom for every nation on Earth. The scientific evidence tells us that an ice age begins rapidly. When it starts, the sun's radiated energy diminishes by 70%, as I have presented extensively in previous exploration videos. The ice age startup happens quickly. It happens at the end of a 3-phase dynamic sequence, of which the first phase is already near half complete. The first phase is the phase of the diminishing solar wind, when the solar wind pressure drops down to 0. The second phase begins, probably in the 2030s. At the second phase shift, the sun itself begins to dim, gradually and imperceptibly to the eye. After the second phase has run its course, the third phase shift happens. At this phase shift, the sun loses 70% of its radiated energy. The Earth becomes an ice planet. The atmosphere of the Earth becomes a featureless ice fog. All the lands outside the tropics, outside the pink zone, become reclaimed by the resulting immense cold under the dimmer sun, when snow no longer melts but accumulates as ice for 90,000 years, while the lands inside the tropics become total deserts, with precipitation diminishing by more than 80%. That's the verdict we can draw from ice core records and from measurements in space. That's what we need to prepare for. The bottom line is that the entire Earth becomes essentially uninhabitable by today's standard in a short period of time, probably in less than a year. Here is where the danger to national security lies. If a nation responds to the challenge and builds itself a new world with advanced technological infrastructures that enable human living to continue on an ice planet that the Earth essentially becomes, then that nation's future is secure and the people will live. If it fails on this count, its people, especially today's children, are essentially dead men walking. In real terms, no nation can meet this challenge alone. It is a common challenge for all nations. The greatest danger to national security is thereby passive in nature, because doom is assured by society doing nothing to prevent it. That's the common core security issue for all nations on Earth. If the nations join hands to respond to the Ice Age challenge, all will live. If not, none will live. No military might, financial power, or political prominence can change the outcome of this choice. To ignore this issue altogether is society's presently universally accepted commitment. It spells doom. With this doom, society commits suicide. Change needs to begin with the recognition that the Ice Age challenge exists, is real, is enormous in consequences, but is a challenge that can be mastered. Unfortunately, the doom that results with doing nothing is presently chosen everywhere in the world. Doom thereby becomes the chosen future for humanity and for many animal species with it. Fortunately, for a highly developed species as humanity is, an active response to the Ice Age challenge is possible, with which doom can be avoided, by which the future security of the nations and the world is assured. Without that, everything that is pursued under the rubric of national security is totally irrelevant, a childish game in comparison. Of course, whether national security is being realized depends on each citizen of a nation and nations and their combined efforts to secure the needed recognition that gets the process started for building the technological infrastructures for human survival on an ice planet that will be our world from the 2050s onward. The challenge is to build a technological world in which a 7 billion population can live and prosper on the Earth when it becomes largely an ice planet. This makes the issue a worldwide issue that pertains not only to one or a few nations, because no nation, no matter how great and powerful it may be, can build the Ice Age infrastructures by itself on any scale. The Ice Age challenge is a universal humanist issue because of the immense scope of the infrastructures required, and also for the simple reason that no one, anywhere, is not affected by the Earth becoming a hostile ice planet. The difficulty lies in recognizing the depths of the effect of the Ice Age consequences. This begins as an issue of conceptualizing our current position on the historic time scale in which ice ages play a role. As I have pointed out in previous videos, the whole of our civilization developed in the brief period of the current interglacial anomaly. The interglacial anomalies are wedged between the long and deep cold glaciation periods of roughly 90,000 years in duration. The two are radically different from each other. The glaciation climate is so radically different than what we have experienced in the epoch of our civilization that it appears that no prior history had existed, even while it is well understood that the human presence on Earth goes back more than 2 million years. All that we have known and have experienced occurred in the current interglacial period, including the development of languages, science, and great cultural achievements. Also wars, slavery, looting, destruction, and massacres occurred in this single period. In this period, we developed ourselves from a 1 million world population into a 7 billion world population. But we have no experiences that we can refer to from the previous glacial times of our world. This disconnect with our past is not surprising when it becomes recognized that we are dealing with two totally different worlds affecting the living of humanity. The climate details that we have gleaned from historic ice samples drilled from the Greenland ice sheet tells us that during the last glaciation period, our Earth had been incomparable with the way we presently find it, and have lived in it for the past 12,000 years. We are looking at two radically different worlds. One world gives us a holiday from the cold, bright, lush, warm, with rivers flowing across the lands, fed by rains from the sky and rich sunshine for easy agriculture across large areas of the lands. The other world gave us a deep, long night of immensely harsh climates that is hard to imagine, with all the lands frozen where most people are living today, and the lands in the tropics existing as deserts, with 80% less precipitation happening worldwide. Now that the current interglacial is ending, our future world from the 2050s onward will be a climate replica of the harsh ice world that in times past had supported only a sparse human population of roughly 1 million worldwide. Our task in the 30 years that we have still left in the present warm times is to create ourselves the technological infrastructures that support our 7 billion population in an ice planet environment in a richly productive and creative manner that is conducive to further human development. When this is achieved, national security is achieved. If the needed efforts are not made, so that the goal is not achieved, then all the children of the world are murdered by default, and much of humanity with it. In this case, the term murder applies because their death results from neglect. The technologies, materials, and energy resources all exist to create the technological infrastructures for a 7 billion world population to exist on the coming ice planet Earth. The term murder applies in the context of the Nuremberg Statute that was established in the trial of Nazi World War criminals who were convicted as murderers exclusively for the effect of their policies on the basis that they knew, or should have known, that these policies or their actions under these policies would result in the mass murdering of people, as had historically happened. The Nuremberg Statute now applies again to national security in the context of the Ice Age challenge, because it is now fully known and scientifically proved in numerous ways that the intention not to act on this front is synonymous with committing the largest mass murder of humanity in the entire history of civilization. The only difference that sets the modern stage apart from the Nuremberg stage is that in the wake of the failure of responding to the Ice Age challenge, there won't be anybody left standing to prosecute the crime, including the criminals themselves. Of course, punitive prosecutions don't prevent crimes anyway. They are as ineffective in their intention as is the application of torture to extract intelligence from military or political prisoners. The effective path for crime prevention is to uplift the cultural environment so that crimes become forgotten history. This path applies most strongly to the Ice Age challenge before us. The greatest crime is committed on this front today almost universally by almost the whole of humanity against itself, with every nation furiously fighting against itself with all its might by hiding and burying the Ice Age challenge before it, by which the crime proceeds. The physical evidence speaks against humanity's survival on this front. The evidence disputes the widely held dreamlike beliefs about the Ice Age dynamics, such as that the Ice Age is a myth, or that it is still 1,000 years distant, or 100 years, and so on. Whoever speaks of an Ice Age challenge in the present landscape of global warming politics is ridiculed as a fool, as a dreamer, or an extremist, or whatever the slander mill comes up with. Nevertheless, above this vast, small-minded veil that society hides behind stands the structure of measured evidence of a reality that is as different from mainstream perception as is the interglacial world from the glacial world. The difference is enormous. Allow yourself to discover it, and it is deadly if left unhealed. The world is flush with mechanistic theories about the universe, the sun, and the climate on Earth. The theories are deadly in their effect, by them hiding the Ice Age dynamics, and the challenge before us to create ourselves a new technological world that enables us to live and flourish in the coming ice planet world from the 2050s onward. At the present stage, which is the stage of mechanistic theories, the whole of humanity has set itself up to be murdered by its own small-minded ignorance and its vehement defense of it. Without the Ice Age challenge being recognized and preparations being constructed for it, no one living today will outlive the 2050s, including the children and those yet unborn. Mechanistic theories have this effect. The most prominent of the mechanistic theories for the ice ages is the Milankovitch cycles theory. The mechanistic theories are necessarily imaginary fairy tales. There are too many of them to list here, but they all share some common features, so that one example will suffice to illustrate their failing. All of them lack exclusive physical evidence and lack common sense. In many cases, they also simply ignore long-established physical principles. Most of the theories are inherently archaic fantasies, in that they were formed about the Sun, the solar system, and the Earth before the technological capability existed to physically observe and measure their dynamics. Milankovitch had theorized in the 1920s that ice ages on Earth are caused by the combined effect of variations in the eccentricity, axial tilt, and precession of the Earth's orbit around the Sun, which he deemed would result in cyclical variations in the solar radiation reaching the Earth. He conveniently ignored the common-sense fact that the total energy received on Earth is always the same, regardless of the shifting of its spin axis and changing orientation, which affects only hemispheric distribution. He also conveniently ignored that Johannes Kepler had already proved way back in the 1600s that the total solar energy received on Earth remains the same even in the case of the shifting eccentricity of its orbit, which affects only seasonal distribution. Ironically, this deeply and fundamentally flawed theory is still enthroned as the reigning theory of the Ice Age phenomenon, contrary to all evidence standing against it. This theory is one of the most deadly national security dangers ever concocted. It is saying to society, "Don't worry about ice ages coming up. The Sun is a constant factor, and the only factor in the equation is the mechanics of the cyclical shifting of the Earth's spin axis by 2.4 degrees over the span of 41,000 years, and its celestial orientation over the span of 26,000 years. The theory says to society, "Don't worry about the next ice age. The mechanics develop so imperceptibly slowly that you have thousands of years to adjust yourself to it." In response to this theory, society remains obediently asleep and dreams of endless summers. But the real world is different. This is where the danger lies. In the real physical world, vastly larger factors rule the scene than orbital mechanics. These are factors that affect the activity of the Sun directly, from far outside the solar system. These are factors that power the Sun in the first place. These are variable interstellar factors that exist in space between the stars, which of course also vary the Sun, with their variances that are resonance effects in plasma electrodynamics. Throughout the interglacial period, the Sun's activity variations also reflect the variations in the supply system for the Sun, caused by resonance factors within the solar system itself and some similar features. With the Sun being essentially a sphere of plasma, interacting with interstellar plasma streams that the solar system is a functional part of, the Sun never remains constant. It follows the roller coaster ride imposed on it by external effects, and it also drops off to a lower default level when the interstellar streams are too weak to maintain the solar system in its present high-powered mode. We are close to getting back to this default level, the Ice Age level. One of the measurements of the historic climate obtained from historic ice core samples drilled from the Greenland ice sheet tells us that the Sun has been gradually weakening over the last 3,300 years. We see a series of big climate spikes that are evidently all caused by the same dynamics, getting progressively weaker. We know that the climate spikes directly result from changes in solar activity, because changing historic solar activity has become directly measurable in terms of carbon-14 isotope ratios in historic samples. As you can see, the historic isotope ratios, measured for the last 1,000 years, follow closely the known historic climate patterns of that period, which is also reflected in ice core data. You can see here that the cold valleys get progressively colder towards the weakest Sun in historic time, that of the Mount or minimum of the Little Ice Age. This was a time when the Sun was so weak that for nearly a century almost no sunspots were observed on the Sun from the Earth. It is reasonable to assume that we came extremely close to losing the interglacial period at this time, and might have lost it if the Sun hadn't been ramped up by one of these periodic up-ramping pulses. The up-ramping pulse gave us almost 300 years of solar-caused global warming. During the up-ramping of the Sun, we got the missing sunspots back in huge numbers. However, the up-ramping was weak. It was in line with the overall weakening of the Sun that began 3,300 years ago. When the weak up-ramping pulse of the 1700s had spent its load in the late 1900s, the solar activity began to drop off sharply. The first reversal in solar activity was noted in the sunspot numbers of the solar cycle in the 1970s. The sunspot numbers recovered slightly, but continued to drop off progressively thereafter in a collapse process that is still ongoing. Unfortunately, the carbon-14 isotope ratios were messed up with atomic bomb explosions and testing from the 1945 onward. That created an additional artificial source for the carbon-14 isotope, so that the isotope ratios no longer represent the intensity of solar activity exclusively from 1945 onward. However, the advances in space exploration technology had made it possible to measure solar activity more directly, by measuring the solar wind pressure in space around the Sun. The result became the NASA and ESO joint space mission named Ulysses. The mission flew a spacecraft in a polar orbit around the Sun. The polar orbit took the spacecraft out of the ecliptic space into clean space, where the measurements are not affected by other factors. The end result of this mission, a 36 years effort from planning to completion, was that it delivered measured proof that the solar activity was indeed collapsing as the diminishing sunspot numbers had suggested. In addition, the Ulysses mission also gave us a precise measurement of the rate of the collapse in solar activity. For the 10 years time frame between its first and third orbit, Ulysses had measured a 30% collapse of the solar wind pressure. That's huge. The mission also measured the underlying solar magnetic field and saw it diminishing at the same fast rate of 30% in the same time frame. And it measured in addition a 20% increase of a specific type of solar cosmic ray flux. The measurements produced by the Ulysses mission are enormously important. They enable us to project the solar dynamics forward in time to determine with a high degree of certainty the time frame in which the dynamic phase shift will likely occur from the current interglacial sun to the low-powered glacial sun. The path to the low-powered glacial sun unfolds in 3 stages, or 3 phases. If one projects the Ulysses measurements of the collapsing solar wind pressure forward in time, the solar wind will reach the 0 point in the 2030s. This marks the end of the first phase. Beyond that, the continuing diminishing plasma streams that power the sun will become reflected in the solar surface temperature itself diminishing. This phase will continue until the electromagnetic primer fields collapse that focus interstellar plasma streams onto the sun. As I said before, these primer fields depend on a minimal rate of plasma flowing to form and to function. When the minimal threshold is not met or exceeded, the fields collapse, whereby the sun loses the densely concentrated sphere of plasma surrounding it. The unfocused plasma streams will continue to power the sun, but only at a much reduced intensity, at roughly 4,000 degrees in surface temperature, instead of the present 5,800 degrees. The sun will thereby emit 70% less radiated energy at this point. That's the point when the second phase ends and the glacial phase begins. This point will likely be reached in the 2050s or sooner. How much sooner the phase shift might happen is hard to ascertain for the lack of historic data. We have the 2050s time frame hinted at by the measurements that the Ulysses mission had brought home as a potential time frame. It gives us a target to work towards. It gives us a reasonable, accurate time frame in which the Earth will revert back to being an ice planet that is largely unsuitable for human habitation, except in a few isolated places. Under the 4,000 degrees sun, which is a 70% weaker sun. All areas outside the tropics become uninhabitable by the accumulating cold, snow and ice. The ice-free zone includes the tropics and subtropics, the region shown in pink here. While these regions remain free of permanent ice, they become uninhabitable too, for the lack of water. The 70% weaker sun produces 80% less precipitation. Solar irradiation is the primary factor for water evaporation into the atmosphere, and without this evaporation, the precipitation diminishes accordingly. The ice-free world becomes largely a desert at this stage. That's the world we need to get ready for. Herein also lies the great value of the Ulysses space mission, in that it enables us to extrapolate a reasonable time frame estimate in which the phase shift to glaciation is likely to occur. The immensely valuable measurements that the Ulysses mission had provided render this insignificant seeming little mission one of the most important contributors for the national security of every nation on Earth. It inspires society to build itself the infrastructures in a timely fashion for the future security of the nations, and this includes every nation's national security. The security of our collective survival on this planet is the only platform for survival there is on an ice planet. Another extremely valuable contribution by Ulysses for everyone's national security is the proof that its measurements have provided that the sun is a phenomenon of electrodynamics, instead of it being powered by mechanistic gas compression that ignites the fabled nuclear fusion process in its core. While no real exclusive evidence exists for the doctrine of the fabled hydrogen sun, the illusion of its existence is one of the factors that block the recognition of the dynamic cosmic processes that actually do power the sun, and for which monumental evidence does exist. The evidence that Ulysses had contributed exists in the form of the sharply defined voids in the solar wind measurements over the sun's poles. These voids exist precisely where one would expect the plasma inflow into the sun to occur, focused onto the sun by the dynamic process of electromagnetic primal fields. The existence of this measured proof takes the theory of the sun as an element of a larger cosmic dynamic process out of the realm of academic concerns and places it into the real world, with existentially critical implications for the whole of humanity in the near term ahead. Of course, inasmuch as the Ulysses mission is a major contributor for the national security of all nations, the entire space program leading up to the Ulysses mission falls into the same category. The Ulysses mission would not have been possible without the Apollo moon landing mission, paving the way into space, and the subsequent space shuttle project in the USA. The Ulysses spacecraft was not launched from the ground, but was launched in space. He was carried into space aboard the Space Shuttle Discovery. The launching of Ulysses was the Space Shuttle Discovery's first mission of a total of 39 missions. Ulysses was launched from the Space Shuttle Discovery on October 6, 1990, in space. It became the fastest spacecraft ever launched up to this time. It encountered Jupiter only a year and 4 months later, on February 1992. The gravity of Jupiter was utilized to swing the spacecraft out of the ecliptic into a polar orbit around the Sun. The swing around started its first orbit. Ulysses flew 3 orbits around the Sun until its communications with the Earth began to fail in June 2009, after more than 18 years of operation. The Ulysses instrument package may not look like much, but this tiny package of instrumentation may yet save humanity from its presently impending doom, should by some miracle its revolutionary measurements in space become unburied and inspire the world's scientific institutions to raise themselves out of the doldrum of being asleep and to wake up the mentally dead along the way, and inspire society to put the spade into the ground, to build itself a new world in which its existence may continue on an ice planet that the Earth is destined to become in the 2050s, or maybe sooner. What you see here, this little 120-pound package of science instruments flying in space, is by far one of the greatest contributors to the national security of any nation that has ever been achieved. It far eclipses all forms of security ever wrought by military might. It eclipses the greatest terror orgies. It eclipses the worst massacres. It eclipses the deadliest political insanity. And it eclipses even the most massive Holocaust in the history of civilization. The biofuels Holocaust of silent murdering happens on a scale that pales every other Holocaust that ever was. If the measurements continue to remain buried, that Ulysses brought home, and associated discoveries remain buried likewise, the historic tragedies will continue and will continue in the name of security, and greater doom will unfold that pales all of them, that will end human existence. Some modern great solar observatory satellites have been launched after Ulysses, like the SOHO satellite. SOHO was launched in December 1995 and has remained in operation for almost 22 years to date. SOHO continuously observes the Sun in numerous ways, including in 4 different light bands outside the visible spectrum. NASA's newest addition to this type is the Solar Dynamics Observatory, or SDO, launched in February 2010. It, together with SOHO, provides us continuously updated, stunning photographs of the Sun, seen in numerous wavelengths simultaneously, including magnetic patterns. The data from both satellites is made available worldwide in real time over the internet, continuously updated as it is received. The problem is that these observatories are designed to observe the sun as a mechanistic entity, rather than as a cosmic dynamic entity. By this, the cosmic interrelationships become obscured, as these are deemed of no importance. The satellites are perfect instruments, of course, to observe what is visually observable, such as the forming of sunspots and solar flares and magnetic loops and so on. But when the observed phenomena are seen without their relationship to the electrodynamics universe and the dramatically weakening of the sun in the context of cosmic dynamics, we get into situations of not being able to see the forest for all the trees. However, the wonderful observations that we now get do confirm that the sunspot numbers have collapsed at roughly the same rate that Ulysses had measured for the collapse of the solar wind. Both the SOHO and SDO satellite also report increasingly larger coronal holes, which are weak areas in the solar corona observed at specific wavelengths. In some cases, the observed weakening in solar dynamics have been rather dramatic. While it is great to observe the sun in real time from space, it takes some honest effort to see the long-term solar collapse reflected in them. For example, it was around 2007 that the first coronal holes were observed. The observation made headlines around the world. Now, we sometimes see coronal holes as big that they almost cover the entire face of the sun, and they don't even raise any eyebrows anymore. But when we make long-term comparisons, the weakening process of the sun shows up rather starkly, even after relatively short periods of time. In other words, the solar collapse process that Ulysses saw the beginning of is continuing unabated. We are presently only halfway through the first phase of the collapse process towards the zero stage of the solar winds in the 2030s. The solar wind can be compared to steam rising from a kettle of boiling water. When the heat is turned up, the water does not get hotter than its boiling point. The excess heat converts more water into steam. When the heat is turned down, less steam is emitted. When the heat is turned down further, the flow of steam stops. That's the stage at which phase 1 ends in the solar dynamics. The solar winds cease. When the heat to the water kettle is reduced still further, after the water stops boiling, the water gets colder. The cooling of the water in the kettle is the phase 2 equivalent in solar dynamics. The surface of the sun becomes colder. We are presently halfway through phase 1 in terms of the sun's diminishing solar wind. When there is not enough plasma density flowing into the sun for it to steam off excess plasma as solar wind, then phase 1 is complete. At this point, phase 2 begins. the sun itself begins to diminish. It begins to cool down. This will begin in the 2030s and continue on till the next phase shift occurs. As the phase shift of the diminishing sun unfolds, we will see some amazingly dramatic effects happening on the sun, such as we cannot imagine yet. Some fringe effects that reflect what's happening on the sun will no doubt be rather sobering then, far more than anything that has yet been experienced. However, the resulting sobering in society, if it happens at all, will come much too late at this point. The sobering will then come too late for us to start building a new world for ourselves at this late stage, for our living to continue on the coming ice planet Earth that no one has yet experienced or told us about. We don't know the precise year of this happening, when the primal fields will collapse that focus plasma onto the sun. It may happen in the 2050s, it may happen sooner. The width of the window is somewhat uncertain, but it will happen as evidence tells us it always has. When the shift to phase 3 takes place, the sun falls back to its 70% reduced state for the next glaciation period. Of course, by then it will be hopelessly too late for society to act to build itself a new world in the tropics. The building of 6,000 new cities or more, and to relocate 7 billion people into them, together with new industries and agricultures, cannot be accomplished at the drop of a hat. It will take, at the very least, a decade to build those thousands of new cities, even with fully automated large-scale industrial production. And before the process of building can even begin, we will need another decade to build the automated industries for building the infrastructures. And before we can begin that, we need to develop the will to do what is necessary to assure the full survival of humanity. And before we get to this critical point, the entire political landscape of the world needs to be uplifted, which presently blocks the Ice Age challenge from being recognized. And that's not an easy one to wake up to. However, we cannot afford to wait until the increasing fringe effects in Phase 1 and Phase 2 hold us to attention. And why should we? We are too intelligent for that. We have it in our heart and soul to move with the wealth of information that we have already accumulated, and to let this to be a sufficient basis for building us a new world. All this means that we must wake up inwardly. The metaphor of Easter is impelling as a correlative for our present situation. On one hand, we have the fascist landscape of Imperial Rome and its institutions represented, which nearly became the grave of civilization, symbolized by the cross throughout time. On the other hand, we have a grand awakening of the human spirit represented, a type of resurrection from the grave, crowned with the assertion of a higher sense of man that gave rise to a new era in the history of time. Both factors now stand before us in the context of the Ice Age challenge. The choice is between a defeated society laying itself down to die in the face of the challenge, and an awakened society dancing in the face of it with joy.